2.6 is combinations of functions. So the domain of a function is all possible x values for which f of x is a real number. So domain is all possible x values. Okay? All x values that work with our function. So find the domain of the following. F of x equals x squared. So is there anything you're not allowed to put into x squared? So whenever I think about it, I'm thinking, can I have zeros? Can I have negative numbers? Can I have positive numbers? I can plug anything in for f of x equals x squared. So the domain is all possible x values in interval notation, that's negative infinity to infinity, or it's a fancy R. Okay, what do you guys know about the domain for the square root function? What are the possible x values for the square root function? Well, if you can't remember, Ryan? Domain. If you can't remember, look at this graph. What x values do I have here? I don't have any negative x values, right? Do I have 0? Yeah. Can I do the square root of 0? Square root of 0 is 0, that's fine. So it's all positive, right? 0 and positive. So I'm going to circle. So whatever's underneath the square root has to be greater than or equal to 0. So how do I write that in interval notation? Good. No, you guys know this. You guys just did it on the test. Okay, what about the cube root function? Can I take the cube root of a negative number? Can I take the cube root of 0? Can I take the cube root of a positive number? What's the cube root of negative 8? Something times itself, something is negative 8? Does that work? Negative 2 times negative 2 is 4, times negative 2 is negative 8. So I can do the cube root of a negative, right? That's because negative 2 cubed is negative 8. And if you can't remember, here's my cube root function. Look, I have all these x values. All these x values are good, right? Yes. So it's all real numbers for the cube. So again, I can do the fancy R, or I can do interval notation. Okay, number 4, m of x equals 2 over x minus 3. What do you guys know about fractions? What's not allowed for a fraction? Negative 1. Denominator cannot equal 0. So in order to figure out what my domain is, I take the denominator and I set it equal to 0. Because I'm going to find that value that it cannot be. If I say x minus 3 does not equal 0, well, x minus 3 does not equal a lot of things. So in order to use the ideas of math, what you do to one side, you do to the other side, you have to have the equals. Okay, so I know the denominator cannot equal 0, so I take the denominator and I set it equal to 0 and I solve. So I add 3 to both sides and I get x equals 3. All right, so in interval notation, how can I say everything except 3? Who's got an idea? Negative infinity to 3, union 3 to infinity. What do you guys think about this? I did soft brackets around 3. because it doesn't include 3, but it includes everything up to 3 on the left and everything up to 3, past 3 on the right, right? So this is interval notation, which is everything except 3. Okay, what do you guys think about number 5? The fourth root of x plus 11. Can you have negative numbers under the fourth root? Can you have 0? Can you have positive numbers under the fourth root? You can have positive. Can I do the fourth root of 0? Something times something times something times something equals 0? Yeah, 0, right? Can I have negative numbers? No. Good. So this, whatever's under the fourth root, is greater than or equal to 0. So I'm going to subtract 11 from both sides, and I get x is greater than or equal to negative 11. So how do I write that in interval notation? Negative 11 to infinity. All right, number 6. G of x equals 8 over the square root of 2x plus 4. What do you guys think? So what do you know about fractions again? The denominator cannot equal 0. And what do you know about square roots? Square roots have to be greater than or equal to 0. But I'm saying it can't actually equal 0. So this would be 2x plus 4. Instead of doing greater than or equal to 0, it would just be greater than 0. Because I can't have the denominator equal to 0, and because whatever's under the square root has to be positive. Has to be greater than or equal to. But I dropped the or equal to. So I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides. And then I'm going to divide both sides by 2. Okay, so how do I write that domain? Good, Blair. Okay, so can somebody summarize with these? Give me an idea. So here I had a square root, here I had a cube root, here I had a square root, or a fourth root. So what do you think the pattern is? With the cube root, it could be negative or positive or 0, right? With the square root or the fourth root, it could not be negative, right? So if I have an even root, it cannot be negative. So if I ever have an even root, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, a million, if I ever have an even root, that has to be greater than or equal to 0. If this is odd, 3, 5, 7, 9, a million and one. If it's odd, it can be anything, okay? The other thing we saw was the denominator of a fraction cannot equal 0, so we set that denominator equal to 0. So if you were to make yourself bullet points or a study guide or something, those would be the 2 points of domain that I would make sure I wrote down. Write down that if you have a fraction, the denominator cannot be 0. If you have an even root, that has to be greater than or equal to 0, and here's how you can kind of combine that, right? So now let's do the algebra of functions. So given two functions f and g, the sum f of x plus g of x equals f plus g of x, and the same thing with the difference. The product f of x times g of x is f times g of x. The quotient f of x divided by g of x is f over g of x, where the domain cannot equal 0, right? The domain of the function is the domain of f intersected with the domain of g. So figure out the domain of each function and figure out The intersection, what's the intersection again? The overlap. Good. What's in this domain and in this domain, right? The overlap. So if you put it on the number line, you shade where it's overlapped, right? Okay, so given f of x equals the square root of x and g of x equals 1 over x plus 2, determine the following and the resulting domains. So f plus g of x, this equals f of x plus g of x, which equals, well, f of x equals this, and g of x equals this. So we're just simply writing down g of x equals 1 over x plus 2. So that's the domain. So what's the domain of f? The domain of f. Well, f is a square root function, so I know that what's under the square root? What? Greater than or equal to 0. So x is greater than or equal to -3. Okay, let's do the domain of g. The domain of g, for g, it's a fraction, right? So I know that the bottom cannot equal 0, so I'm going to take the bottom and set it equal to 0 so that mathematically it makes sense. So I'm going to subtract 2 from both sides. Okay, so now let's put these both on the number line because we need to look for the intersection, which we did in one section, right? It's the overlap. So let me do, in blue, I'll do, so I need -3, -2. I like to have at least 3 values, right? X is greater than or equal to -3, so at -3 I have a closed circle. Which way am I shading? To the right, good. Now how do I draw everything except for -2? Open circle around -2, and then everything else is shaded. So now I'm looking for the overlap, right? What's in both? So -3 is in both. Oh, -2 is not in both, but then all over here. So how can I write all of this in interval notation? What's in between 2? Union. Blair's got it. Do you guys understand this? So this is where I think it's really helpful to draw the number line to do the overlap, because then writing an interval notation is not that bad. So this is the domain for number 7 and the domain for number 8. This is the domain for any of these that were asked, right? Once we find the domain once, we can do the addition, subtraction, difference, product, and the domain is the same for all of them. What do you guys think about number 8? Can you do it? You want to do it on an extra piece of paper for a quiz? No? All right. So all you have to do is write out the definition, right? Here I have the same thing like this. F minus g, here I have g minus f, so I'm going backwards. So this is g of x minus f of x. So I'm going to write down what g of x is. G of x is 1 over x plus 2 minus f of x is the square root of x plus 3. We don't need to simplify. We're just making sure we know these definitions, right? So those are the answers.